Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that really challenges how we think about the human body and society itself, the philosophy of disability.
So, let's just jump right in with the big question, right? When you hear the word disability, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it a deficiency? A lack of something that should be there?
Well, if you're looking for a simple yes or no, you're not going to find it in a medical textbook. The philosophical sources we're digging into today tell us that the answer, well, it depends entirely on how you look at it. It's a huge question of perspective with a really long and complicated history.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll try to pin down what disability even means. Then we'll look at the different models people have used to view it, trace its role throughout the history of philosophy and religion, and wrap things up by talking about meaning and responsibility.
First up, what exactly is disability? As we're about to see, the definition itself is a huge battleground of ideas.
The source material we're looking at is really interesting because it prefers a term that translates to something like the hindered or the obstructed. Now, this is so much more than just a word choice. It's a massive shift in perspective. The word itself does two things at once. Sure, it acknowledges an individual's condition, but it also points a finger directly at the external barriers that society puts in their way.
And that idea leads to something pretty radical. This whole concept of a normal body, it's not a scientific fact. Not at all. It's a social construct. It's basically a value judgment that's been shaped by our culture, our ideology, and our social class, not by biology. It's a lot like how concepts of race have been constructed over time.
So, how did we get to this point? To this idea of disability as a social construct? The best way to get our heads around it is to look at how our thinking has evolved through four really distinct models. You can think of them as four different lenses for viewing the exact same thing.
It all started with the moral model, which, believe it or not, saw disability as a punishment for some kind of sin. Then things got a bit more clinical. We got the medical model, which frames disability as a medical problem inside a person that needs to be fixed. But then that view was challenged in a big way by the social model. This model says, hey, wait a minute. The problem isn't the body, it's the inaccessible world we've built. And finally, there's this really fascinating fourth lens, the limitation model. It suggests that, look, being human is about being limited in some way. Disability isn't a defect, it's just another variation on that universal theme.
So let's really zero in on this. Where is the problem? That's the key question. The medical model points to the individual. It says the problem is in the body. It's a deficiency. But the social model, it completely flips the script. It says the problem is out there in society's barriers. In that view, it's not a deficiency at all, it's just a human difference.
Okay, so with those models in our back pocket, let's take a look at how this all played out in the history of philosophy. And believe me, it was a real battle of ideas.
And you can see this battle of ideas going way, way back. It's an ancient and really stark contrast. Over in ancient Greece, you've got giants like Plato and Aristotle basically arguing for a form of eugenics. They propose that defective infants shouldn't be raised, all for the good of their ideal state. But at the exact same time, over in ancient China, you have the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi telling a completely different story. He talks about a man whose physical differences actually became an advantage. They saved him from being drafted into war, letting him live a long, full life. I mean, what a contrast, right? One worldview sees difference as a threat to be stamped out, and the other sees it as a potential strength.
And this timeline really shows how slow and messy that evolution of thought has been. You've got Zhuangzi challenging the whole idea that difference is a bad thing, right next to Plato and Aristotle advocating for elimination. Fast forward centuries to 1516, and you have Thomas More's Utopia. It says you shouldn't mock people with disabilities, but it also allows for voluntary euthanasia. It's not until we get to the 20th century, with someone like Michel Foucault, that we really start to analyze how the whole concept of normal is constructed and enforced by systems of power to serve economic and political goals.
Now, it wasn't just philosophy that had to grapple with this. Religious thought shows a similar and maybe even more dramatic clash between what the sacred texts say and what people actually did in practice.
If you look at the sacred texts of the Abrahamic faiths, the message seems pretty clear. The Torah explicitly says, you shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. It's an explicit command for compassion. In these traditions, disability is often framed not as a curse, but as a test from God, a chance for the community to step up and show kindness and virtue.
But what actually happened in history was often the total opposite. During the European Middle Ages, those compassionate ideals got completely twisted.
disability was often seen as a sign of demonic possession, or witchcraft, or a divine curse. And the treatment? It wasn't kindness, it was brutal, torture, being locked away, even execution.
This is what makes this tale of two Middle Ages so fascinating. At the same time that priests in Europe were treating mental illness with exorcisms and torture, doctors in the Islamic world, in places like 8th century Damascus, were treating it in medical facilities. This really shows the massive difference between a purely dogmatic approach and one that manages to integrate science and reason with faith. The outcomes for people were, as you can imagine, profoundly different.
So all of this history brings us right back to the biggest philosophical questions. Why does disability even exist? How are we supposed to make sense of it? And maybe most importantly, what is our responsibility to each other?
And your worldview really changes how you answer those questions. If you're a theist, believing in an active, caring God, then disability might be seen as a test of faith, part of a bigger divine plan that gives it purpose. But if you're a deist, believing God created the world and then stepped back, it can feel like a random flaw, a sense of cosmic injustice. And for an atheist, with no God in the picture, it can be seen as just a genetic mistake, a random accident. And we have to be careful here, because that last view has, historically, been twisted into some really dangerous ideas like social Darwinism.
Now, for those who do believe, there's a really interesting theological idea called the soul-making argument. It's an attempt to solve the problem of evil. The basic idea is that hardships like disability exist for a reason, to help all of us develop virtues. Think about it. How can we learn compassion if there's no one to be compassionate towards? How can we learn patience or courage without challenges to overcome? In this view, suffering is what helps our souls grow.
So, okay, what about our ethical obligations? This is where philosophy, especially the ideas of Immanuel Kant, gives us a really solid framework. Kantian duty ethics basically says that our responsibility to support people with disabilities and remove barriers is an unconditional universal duty. It's not something we do because we feel sorry for someone or because it makes us look good. We do it for one simple reason, because it is the right thing to do, period.
And here's the kicker. Fulfilling that duty, it isn't really about helping the disabled. It's about completing our own moral development. The real ethical test here isn't on the person with the disability. It's on the rest of us. It's on the society we've built. By making the world more accessible, we're not just helping other people. We are actually becoming better, more complete human beings ourselves.
Which brings us full circle, right back to where we started, but hopefully with a totally new way of seeing things. So I'll leave you with this question. Is the real barrier in a person's body, or is it in the rules, the attitudes, and the physical structures of the society we've all built? Perhaps the most disabling thing of all is an environment that refuses to adapt.